We're happy tonight to have Ron FIrштейn, a longtime Chappaqua resident and author of the book, The Triumph of Genius. Mr. FIrштейn was a patent attorney who worked with Edwin Lэнд on his landmark legal battle between Polaroid and Kodak. Mr. Lэnd was a lifelong inventor and larger-than-life scientist and the man who inspired Steve Jobs. Here to bring us an eyewitness account, please welcome Ron FIrштейn.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's been fun. I mean, I guess the snow is all melted at this point, and I apologize for the delay in this, the running of this program, but in a way it's probably a good thing because in the interim I've had a chance to travel around the country and do about 25 or 30 of these for different organizations. So I'm a little more rehearsed now than I might have been in February. But it is different to be doing it in front of so many friends and family and familiar faces. So I just have, two rules, if you will. Heckling is okay, but snoring is not. You got it, Jeff? Okay. Actually, there's someone else who was, it was my brother who was threatening to snore. Well, I thought we'd start with a little game of Guess Who, okay? If that's okay with everybody. Let's see if we can guess who this person is. This person was a college dropout. He founded and led, virtually single-handedly, the most glamorous technology company of the 20th century. New products were introduced in dramatic demonstrations he personally conducted at his company stockholder meetings. Those events got a lot of attention and a lot of anticipation. I'm sure you're all already guessing who that might be. He rejected traditional market testing for his company's products and instead wanted to deliver his personal vision of what he thought people might want rather than what people were asking for. He had an astonishing aesthetic sense and wasn't really a consensus builder, but ran his company pretty much as an autocracy. Are we there yet? One more. He amassed 535 patents in his name and died third on the list of US inventors, behind only Thomas Edison and one of Edison's colleagues. So I'm sure you all know who it is, right? Wrong. In order for it to be Steve Jobs, we would have to reduce the number of patents to about 300. And of course, we would have to change the company from the 20th century to the 21st century. But maybe I'll give you a few more clues, and we'll see if we can actually get it. At the end of World War II, Harry Truman and General Eisenhower, who was taking on the presidency, met with a bunch of elite scientists that were advising the presidency and told them that, Eisenhower in particular, that he was very worried about what the Russians were doing. So this gentleman stepped forward and said, well, why don't we take a look? And put together a group of scientists that came up with this, which was the U-2 spy plane. Went into service in the 1950s, and I understand there's a version of it that's still in service today. Of course, it became famous in the 60s when Francis Gary Powers was shot down as the pilot of one, and it was certainly a critical piece of intelligence in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that isn't all he did, because all the successes that he had working for the US government in World War II and in the Cold War led him to lead a panel of scientists that worked with the CIA for decades. And out of that panel came things like the Polaris submarine, the first submarine to shoot missiles from underwater, and the Corona spy satellite. In fact, he worked for 7 presidents over 4 decades until he wound up on Richard Nixon's enemies list, believe it or not. And he resigned from this government panel. But he did come back when Gerald Ford took over the presidency. Well, we have a better guess now? Of course, yes, it was this gentleman, Edwin Lэнд, who was the founder of Polaroid and one of the most amazing American inventors and technologists that no one's ever heard of. it's okay if you've confused him with Steve Jobs and if you guessed Steve Jobs originally, because it's clear that Steve Jobs admired Land and stated so during his lifetime, and in fact modeled much of his career after Land's. I'll show you a couple of examples. If you look at these two pictures, on the right, I guess your left, is Edwin Land introducing the SX70 camera and film in 1972. Seated on a black chair with a Saarinen tulip table next to him. And of course, on the other side is Steve Jobs introducing the iPad in 2010. Different chair, same table, no coincidence. In 1972, when SX70 came out, journalists asked Land, well, how much market research did you do before you committed $500 million of your company's profits to this research and development program? Now, you have to remember, that's $500 million in the 60s. So what are we talking about, 4 or 5 billion today? It's quite a lot of money they poured into this research and development. And Land's answer? None. We don't do market surveys. We create the markets with our products. Well, does that sound familiar to anybody? When Steve Jobs was asked the same question about the iPad and the iPod and so on, his answer was the same. It isn't the consumer's job to know what they want, something he clearly inherited from Edwin Land. And fairly recently, I saw Tim Cook, who's the current CEO of Apple, introducing the Apple Watch. And here's his statement. Apple's whole role in life is to give you something you didn't know you wanted. Well, as I said before, it really is sort of amazing that Edwin Land is so little known. And one of the motivations to me for writing this book was to try and remedy that a bit. But I have to be honest that until I learned about him in midlife, really, or as a young man, I guess, I didn't know who he was either. I mean, I had one of these cameras. This is an SX70. We'll talk more about it later. And I knew that all of the Polaroid cameras and film always said SX70 Land camera or Model 95 Land camera. But I never knew what Land meant. I always thought it referred to the ground, like they were trying to distinguish it from an underwater camera or something like that. I never really realized that it was a man, but indeed, it was someone really special, and someone, the more I learned about him and the more I learned about the circumstances of what he did, the more important I thought he became, and the more I was determined to try and get some more information out about him. His career, I'll touch on a few highlights of his career, and it's really sort of interesting how it all started, and it's probably a story that most of you can relate to. I mean, imagine having a 17-year-old college student enrolled in a great academic institution, a kid that you know is really, really bright and really, really special. But after the first semester, your son or daughter comes home and says, "Mom, Dad, I'm dropping out of school. I have this idea on a scientific experiment that I want to do that's much more interesting than what I'm learning in college. And so I want to drop out of school and just apply myself to that. Oh, and by the way, I need 70 grand in order to do this work." Back in the day, because this was 1927, it was only $5,000, but that's exactly what Edwin Land said to his father at the end of his first semester at Harvard. Interestingly, his father was concerned, as I guess any of us would have been concerned, but his father wasn't concerned about his kid dropping out of school, nor was he concerned about the money. His father was concerned that when his son solved the problem, he would be ripped off by some big corporation that would come along and steal his invention from him. So Harry Land said to Edwin, "You can drop out, I'll give you the money, but you have to promise me when you solve the problem, you will protect yourself." Well, that's exactly what happened. Of course, the investigation that Land had in mind had nothing to do with photography. It had to do with something called polarization, which is a phenomenon of optics that has been known since the 17th century. People knew or observed that certain materials could take the glare out of bright light back in the 17th century. Unfortunately, the only materials that anybody knew about that could do this were things like this, Iceland spar crystal, big pieces of rock. People could think of lots of applications for a more practical material, like, well, Land's first idea was to take the glare out of automobile headlights, but also sunglasses, camera filters, so on and so forth. But nobody could come up with a practical material that could be used. And this is what obsessed him. He dove into that problem completely and immersed himself in it, and it took him all of 18 months to figure it out. When he was 19 years old, he figured out a way to embed in a very thin sheet of plastic thousands and thousands of microscopic crystals and how to array them in a perfect array that would allow this thin piece of plastic to polarize light. Again, he was 19 years old. This is a problem that had eluded the greatest physicists on the planet for hundreds of years. Fortunately, he remembered his father's admonition about protecting himself, and he went to seek a patent lawyer and did find one. And now let's just stop for a second here to talk about patents, because it's a term that's used a lot and not everybody really understands what it means. This is the best articulation, simple articulation of the patent system I've found, actually, which is a statement by, of all people, Abraham Lincoln in 1860. But the idea is very simple. The patent system is something we stole from the English in 1624, I believe it was. Yes, that's correct. They came up with their own patent law. And the deal was very simple. If you invent something, you disclose it to the public in a document called a patent. If you do that, in return, you get a monopoly in your invention for a limited period of time. That limited period of time is 17 years in today's system. It was for most of Land's life as well. And it's a very simple quid pro quo, and it's the basis for innovation, a basis for the system of allowing inventors to create their inventions and to create an incentive for them to work at this. So Land found a great patent lawyer, and they filed his application, and this is the first patent he received. It was filed in 1929 when Land was 19 years old. It was issued in 1933. It takes a few years for you to convince the patent office that you're entitled to your patent, so it doesn't always happen overnight. But when his patent attorney, a fellow named Donald Brown, called him up to tell him about the patent, it was actually one of those good news, bad news kinds of phone calls. The good news was the patent was going to issue and Land would have his first patent. The bad news was he wasn't alone. This fellow, Lewis Warrington Chubb, who was the head of research at Westinghouse, a formidable company, also had the same idea about using polarizer to take the glare out of light in special situations, particularly automobile headlights. And Chubb had filed applications with the patent office for that, on that concept. Fortunately, Land was the only one with a practical material. Chubb only had the idea. And so Chubb's applications had not been approved by the patent office yet. But yet that did not stop him from going out into industry and speaking to all of the same companies that Land and Land's lawyer were talking to about doing business based upon the polarizer. So Chubb was out there as a real nuisance. And you have to, again, remember, we're talking about a 19-year-old kid versus a middle-aged head of industry, the head of research at a formidable company, out there talking to the same companies about making deals for a polarizer. Long story short, Land prevailed in every situation because he had the patent and Chubb didn't. He had the material, Chubb didn't. At the end of the day, Land actually bought out Chubb and his small company he had formed, and Lewis Warrington Chubb became a Polaroid employee for the rest of his career. So very early on, his father's advice proved to be valuable, and Land got the benefit of the patent system, which really registered with him and for the rest of his career influenced a lot of his actions. Having the patent allowed Land to create a $200 million company by the time he was 25 years old. All kinds of products were created. Kodak bought some of the material to make camera filters. On the right are the very first Polaroid sunglasses. He licensed the technology to a company called American Optical. And this was all happening in the late 30s, so before you know it, we were embroiled in World War II. And it became apparent very quickly that this polarizer technology had all kinds of applications for the war. And so Polaroid ended up making a whole host of devices that were used in the war effort. This is a picture of General Patton wearing a pair of Polaroid goggles, there to take the glare out of the desert sun. But Polaroid made goggles for aircraft pilots who had to land at night with no lights on, and all kinds of applications. Gun sights, 3D imaging that showed our armed forces what the Normandy beaches looked like before we landed. And at the end of the day, World War II was very good to Polaroid and very good to Land. And it actually is what led to him getting involved in all of that government work that I talked about earlier with the U-2 spy plane and so on and so forth. The other sort of bookend of Land's experiments with, experience with patents is, of course, the Polaroid Kodak litigation, which I talk about at length in the book. And it really is the most important technology litigation of the 20th century. I think it's best really understood from a slightly different angle. And really one of the themes of my book that I wanted to bring out was the relationship between two companies and what that led to this. Polaroid and Kodak, two great technology companies. Over 60 years, they went from being mentor and protege to arch enemies. And how that happened, how that unfolded, and why it unfolded is a tremendous story on its own, and really is the backstory to this litigation. Very quickly, in 1934, as I said before, Kodak was the very first customer of Land's. They bought the equivalent of $100,000 of that polarizing material so they could make camera lenses, and that was just the first order. In 1943, when Land decided to start doing some experiments in photography, an interesting story in its own, but you may have to buy the book to read why he was encouraged to do that. Who did he turn to? He turned to his friends at Eastman Kodak for materials, chemicals, paper, plastic, that he could use in his experiments, even though Kodak had no idea what he was working on. In 1947, Land came up with his first one-step photography system, a system where you could take the picture and see the image within minutes. He demonstrated it at the Optical Society of America in New York in 1947. And this is sort of the iconic photograph that many of you have probably seen at one point or another. But in doing my research at the Harvard Business School, I found this photograph, which is a little more playful. It's the same event, and there's Land sitting at the table holding up the photograph he just took. But he's teasing all the photographers. He's saying, look, I'm showing you my work, let me see yours. It was a great event, and the following year, Polaroid put out the very first one-step camera and film system. This is the Model 95 camera that came out that year. I encourage you, when we're all done, you guys can come up and look at these. This is an amazing piece of engineering. And it has a very interesting feature to it. If you do pick it up, you'll see that it's quite heavy. It weighs about 3 ounces more than 4 pounds, and that's not by accident. For some reason in World War II, the government decided to impose a tax on amateur cameras. Well, how did they define amateur cameras? Anything that weighed less than 4 pounds was an amateur camera. Anything that weighed more was professional. Well, Land and his buddies made sure that that camera weighed at least 4 pounds because they knew it was already going to be expensive. It cost about the equivalent of $900 when it first came out. And so they didn't want that extra tax on top in terms of the cost. But it's an amazing device to this day. To go back to Kodak, they were obviously pleased to see what Land came up with these materials they supplied, but they were even more pleased when Land went to them and said, you know, it's going to be too hard for us to make the negative for our film. So Kodak, will you manufacture the negative for our film? And Kodak said, of course. Well, that started an amazing relationship. Starting in the 1940s, Kodak manufactured the negative for every Polaroid film. This went on well into the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, Polaroid was Kodak's second largest corporate customer, second only to the cigarette manufacturers for whom Kodak made the small white cylinders, plastic cylinders they turned into filters. Other than that, Polaroid was their biggest customer. A usually mutually beneficial relationship between these two companies. But if you ask Kodak what they thought of Polaroid, the answer was not much. Because Polaroid was a niche. Although they were making plenty of film, in these early models, you would pull the film out of the camera, you had to time the development, then you had to peel it apart, then you had to coat the print with a chemical to stabilize the image, and if you wanted it to lie flat, you had to mount it on a piece of cardboard. All of that really made it a bit cumbersome, and in Kodak's view, kept it as a niche market that could not possibly challenge Kodak's dominance of the amateur photography market. In 1957, the two companies started work on bringing some color chemistry that was developed at Polaroid into the commercial world. Very complicated program. It got a lot of attention because a lot of money went into it, but even then, when Kodak was asked, they had no interest in getting into the field. Polaroid was a fine competitor and a fine customer. In 1963, it took 5 full years to take this Polaroid chemistry from the laboratory to the marketplace. In 1963, the first Polaroid color film came out, still peel apart. Again, when that happened, it was big news. As you can see, this is, I think, from Life magazine. It was a huge spread, about 10 pages in Life magazine back then. It was big news, but when Kodak was asked, again, here's Kodak's own press release, they have no plans for entering the field that Polaroid had pioneered. When did all that change, you ask? Changed in 1968 when Land showed his friends at Kodak the prototype for what became SX70. That famous format of a photograph with the white border, the large white border at the bottom. It was the first what they call integral instant photograph, and they meant by integral the fact that it came out of the camera and developed in your hand, and you did not have to time it, you did not have to peel it apart, you didn't have to coat the print, you didn't have to mount the print, nothing. You just take the picture and you have an image in your hand in 1 minute. When Kodak saw that, they freaked out. For the first time, they thought maybe Polaroid has something that could infringe on our, encroach is the better word, I'll save infringement for later, encroach on our market. They did their own economic analysis. These quotes are from documents that we found during the discovery phase of the litigation. Kodak decided that Polaroid's new system could reduce their sales by $6 billion over 10 years. Now you got to remember, that's $6 billion in 1968. That's a big number in today's dollars. And they also acknowledged that they had no reason to believe that they could design a competing system without a license from Polaroid. So what happened? They went back to Dr. Land and they said, listen, we'll help you with this new film the way we have with all your other films, but only under one condition. You have to let us manufacture some and sell it in our own yellow boxes and compete with you. This is not something Polaroid could abide. This was David and Goliath. As successful as Polaroid was, it was a small fraction of the size of Kodak. It never, even in its heyday later, never was more than 1/8 the size of Kodak. Polaroid did not believe it could compete in the marketplace with Kodak. And so Land said, we can't do that. You know, you're not happy making all this money as a supplier? Why do you have to come in and compete with us directly? But things had changed, and you'll read about it in the book, very dramatic on personal level, on a lot of different levels. The attitudes had changed among the executives involved. And Kodak wouldn't back down. So at that point, the two companies went their separate ways. Polaroid went off to try and figure out how to manufacture negative, which is, you can imagine, a really complicated thing. You have to coat layers and layers of chemicals on paper, and these are photosensitive chemicals, so this all has to be done in the dark. It's a crazy thing to try and make. Polaroid had to figure out how to do that for the first time in their history, and Kodak went off to develop their own competing system. Well, it took 4 years for Polaroid to be ready to introduce its first system. It put out the SX70 camera. I brought one here. This is one of the originals with a leather case. It has a leather case, actually, that it comes in, but it also has leather laminate all over it. We talked about Dr. Land's aesthetic sense. This was something that was very important to him. And it had to fit in a man's suit pocket, which it does. It was an amazing event, an amazing piece of technology. You know, I saw a quote by Arthur Clarke, the science fiction writer, who said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Well, SX70 really was magic, and it made a splash, a publicist's dream. Land was on the cover of every magazine, and people were very excited about this advance in technology. However, in Rochester, the home of Kodak, they were freaking out again, because they were already 4 or 5 years into their program to come up with a competing system. And when they looked for the first time at what Polaroid put out and compared it to what they were working on, it was clear that what they had was wildly inferior. Details, chapter 9. They went back to the drawing boards at Kodak, and it took them 4 more years to come out with a system. In 1976, that's Walter Fallon, who was the president of Kodak at the time. They came out with this to compete with this. Now, well, at Polaroid, they used to call this the parking meter. It was slightly inelegant, but here's the rub. All of this research was done in complete secrecy. When Polaroid was working on its system, Kodak really had no idea what they were going to come out with, which is why they were so surprised in 1972 when they saw SX70. Similarly, Polaroid had no idea what Kodak was doing, and they were scared. Kodak was the most formidable photographic research company on the planet in the history of the world, anywhere, bar none. There was no second place company. Polaroid feared, and Dr. Land feared, that when Kodak came out with a system finally, especially given it had taken them like 8 years, they were just going to leapfrog Polaroid. So there were a lot of nervous people up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Kodak announced it was finally going to release its system. It was going to be done in New York, big event at the Plaza Hotel. Polaroid asked for an invitation. Kodak said no. Polaroid sent a couple of its young people, somehow got them press credentials, sent them down to the event undercover. And at the end of the meeting, Kodak executives gave out samples of the camera and film to all the journalists who were there. So you can imagine these 2 young kids jumped in a cab, headed for LaGuardia, grabbed the first Boston shuttle, jumped in another cab, and raced to Technology Square in Cambridge, where Dr. Land and some other Polaroid executives, and my bosses, by the way, because by this time, Polaroid had lawyered up, were all anxiously awaiting in the Polaroid boardroom to see what Kodak was coming out with. Were they going to leapfrog us and put us out of business, or what? Well, it didn't take long for them to realize that Kodak had not leapfrogged anyone, and that while there were some differences in the operation between the two, Kodak's system used some very important key elements of Polaroid's technology. And that left Polaroid with no alternative but to sue Kodak for patent infringement. And within 5 days of Kodak's introduction, Polaroid filed suit in Boston federal court alleging that Kodak infringed Polaroid's patents. Now, Dr. Land articulated the reason for why Polaroid had to do this, despite their long, again, they'd had a 40-year, well, I guess at that point it was only a 30-year relationship. Well, no, 40 years, from the mid-30s to the mid-70s. To the rest of the photographic industry, instant photography is a thing apart. What he's saying there is that Kodak has a million different businesses, but Polaroid only has one. To Polaroid, it is the whole of life. We took nothing from anybody. We gave a great deal to the world. The only thing keeping us alive is our brilliance, and the only thing that keeps our brilliance alive is our patents. Of course, this is where I entered the story in my minor way. And I don't appear in the book, so this is not a memoir or anything like that. But I did work on the team of lawyers that represented Polaroid in this case. And through some circumstances that I still don't understand to this day, after a few years, I ended up working with Dr. Land directly. He was assigned to me. I think he sort of picked me out from a group of young lawyers that he wanted to work with. And I ended up training him to be a witness for his deposition, and then later for the trial. I wrote the outline for his testimony at the trial. He was our star witness. And it was a wonderful experience working with him. I mean, he was truly a giant of a man. But he wasn't always interested in doing what he was supposed to be doing. And there were days when we would be in his office and he wanted to goof around instead of do the work we were supposed to be doing, like showing me how brilliant the colors would be on the brand new Time Zero film that Polaroid was about to come out with. So he made me hold up this bright envelope and he took a picture of me. And of course, you know, I grabbed the camera at one point and took a picture of him as well. But here's the interesting thing about those two photographs in particular. When I was researching this book, I spent a lot of time at the Harvard Business School. Their Baker Library is the repository for all of Polaroid's archives. Dr. Land was a very private person, and again, I go into detail in the book, but he had all of his personal papers destroyed when he died. There's nothing left. So you look through the Polaroid archives, and they are voluminous, but it's virtually impossible to find anything directly related to Land. You can find a memo in someone else's file that was from Land or to Land, but none of Land's files himself. So I'm going through there trying to find, you know, I found a lot of stuff there, believe me. But one day, all of a sudden, I see the name of a file, and it says, Dr. Land's coffee table, 1980, well, or 81. I got to see this one. I have them bring it to me. I open it up, and all that's in there are about 7 or 8 SX70 photographs, including these two. Apparently, you know, when we've done goofing around and finished our work for the day, his secretary had collected these photographs, put them in a file, and somehow that file found its way into the Polaroid archives. And so I am proud to announce that I will live forever in a file at the Harvard Business School with Dr. Land. There's actually a more interesting photograph of me that relates to Dr. Land. As I said before, Land was our star witness. So he was our first witness at the trial. We put him on, he was one of the inventors of several of the patents. But we also put him on as the father of the technology, and we wanted him to tell the history of instant photography, to put in context the case, which is a very technical case. Patent cases really come down to a lot of science and technology. But it's very important to put them in context. It really helps your presentation. So we got Judge Zobel to waive the restriction on photographs being taken in the courtroom, just for that day. And Dr. Land took a series of photographs with different Polaroid cameras to show how the field had developed. He actually took the first one with a camera just like this. He had special film, because the film was no longer available for this. He had special film made just for that purpose. And so sitting on the witness stand in Boston Federal Court on the first day of trial, he took a picture to show the judge. Well, standing right in front of him were his lawyers. So this is the picture he took. Standing up here is William K. Kerr. He was the figurehead, the elder statesman of our team. He was 4 years past retirement, but he hung around only because he wanted to finish his career by putting Dr. Land on the stand at the beginning of this trial. And he's reading my script, and he worked completely from my script. And as soon as he was done with Dr. Land as a witness, he retired. And he watched the rest of the case from his home in Bermuda. It was one of the crazier things. The real star of our team and the genius behind our legal team was a fellow named Herbert F. Schwartz, who later became the senior partner, managing partner at Fish and Neve, which was the firm I was at. Taught patent law at Penn and NYU, and really was one of America's foremost patent litigators. And he ran the trial, he ran the case really from beginning to end. So he's sitting there at counsel table, but in between them is a young man who maybe looks like he's smiling, but was actually really scared to death. So I think that's a tension expression, not a smiling one. I think I have time to just tell you one quick story about Dr. Land and the trial before I wrap up here. Because it really, you know, these trials are close, they're difficult. Of course, we thought we had a winning case. Kodak thought they had a winning case, which is why cases like this don't settle, although there were some other reasons. But Dr. Land proved to be the star for us. And I'll just tell you one quick anecdote about it. One of Dr. Land's patents in suit was something we called symmetrical supports, which on its face seemed overly simplistic. Like you take two pieces of plastic and put them on the outside of the film unit, and it'll lay flat. Doesn't seem like much of an invention, right? And Kodak didn't think it was much of an invention. But as it turns out, it was a real invention, because if you look at this and think about it, the conventional wisdom would be to make one side or the other permeable to water so that this thing could dry out, because you know there's a little bit of liquid processing composition that gets spread in between here to make the picture. Well, both companies tried this with all kinds of combinations of plastics to come up with the right plastic that would allow the picture to dry out and yet lay flat. But they couldn't. Until Dr. Land one day had the breakthrough idea of not bothering to let it dry out. We could have a wet forever photo unit for a lot of reasons. You'll read about it. This was a departure from what everybody thought needed to happen. And so while we were telling the story of that invention, we introduced a lot of failed experiments, right? To show how hard it was to come up with this. And they all were film units that looked like this. They were all curled like the letter C. When Kodak's witness, an expert in film, supposedly, took the stand really months later, he was asked by Kodak's lawyer to explain why the experimental film units curled. And he gave a theory that, well, I guess he believed it, but he said that the chemical processing composition inside reacted with the permeable layer, caused it to deform and stretch, and so the film unit got stretched and sat like this. Fine. The problem was, it had no relation to reality. Now, when Dr. Land finished testifying, he didn't come back to the courtroom because he thought it would be a distraction, and it was, but he followed that case carefully. When the lawyers got a transcript at the end of every day's proceedings, so did Dr. Land. Dr. Land had his closest assistant in the courtroom every day, taking copious notes, reporting back to him immediately on everything that took place. When Dr. Land heard about this testimony by the Kodak film expert, he went bonkers. He went completely apoplectic because he couldn't believe that this guy is supposed to be an expert, could get up on the stand and spin that kind of theory. At the end of the case, we had an opportunity to do a rebuttal case, which just means at the very end we could present some stuff to correct what Kodak had done since they went second. Usually don't do a big rebuttal case, but there were a few things we wanted to correct. Well, Dr. Land was all over my boss because he wanted to testify again, because this thing was pissing him off, and a few other things as well. And he wanted the chance to go up and one more time rebut Kodak. But that wasn't it, really. And I really couldn't believe my eyes when he said this. I don't want to just testify. I don't want to talk. I'm a scientist. I want to go up there and I'm going to do a demonstration for the court and show them why that theory is crazy. I thought my boss would have a cow. You know, in patent litigation, you don't generally want to do demonstrations. It's a little risky. I think the feeling about those started in the early 20th century during the unbreakable light bulb case. When the inventor dropped his light bulb in front of the Supreme Court and it shattered on the floor together with his case. So doing demonstrations in a courtroom like that is a complete no-no. But Dr. Land was indefatigable, insisted on doing it. Make a long story short, he got up there, he explained this did not curl because of that. The plastics cannot react with the processing composition. They didn't stretch, they didn't deform. All that happened was because there was differential drying, the thing curled, and then it dried, and so the remnants, the chemicals that were residual inside there, sort of acted as glue and kept this thing curled all this time. And he says, I'm going to prove it to you. So he takes the curled film unit, we hand him a pair of scissors, and he cuts around the edge, all four sides, like you would taking the crust off of a piece of white bread. And then this thing is still curled, and he takes the two pieces of plastic, peels them apart, and laid them on the table, flat as a pancake. In patent law, we do not have Perry Mason moments. This was as close to a Perry Mason moment as I think ever occurred in a patent case. And of course, the audible sigh, the audible sound in the courtroom was my boss, who began to breathe again when this thing happened. To wrap up, Polaroid won the case, prevailed on 7 out of the 10 patents. Kodak was enjoined from further infringement, which meant that they had to take all their cameras and film out of the stores even before the case was appealed. This was an amazing result. And later on, Kodak was assessed almost $1 billion in damages. An important case for a lot of reasons. Patents have gone up and down in favor over the years. They have been abused, like a lot of good things. So there have been times when there have been antitrust concerns and other problems with patents. The mid-20th century was such a time, but this Polaroid case really returned patents to a position of importance in the American courts. You can read some of these quotes and see what observers thought about the result in the case back in the 80s. And why is that important? You know, I just recently saw this quote from a patent professor at Penn Law School. It's important for America because in America we don't make stuff anymore, but we still invent stuff. And so having a strong patent system is very important to innovation and technology in our country. And the Polaroid case really was a turning point to return us to that. And at the end of the day, in words that were spoken by Herb Schwartz but really could have come out of Dr. Land's mouth, the case signaled a return to a pro-patent era in which the emphasis is on protecting a climate for innovation. You've been very kind. Thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Anybody have any questions?
Go ahead.
First patent you showed it was Land et al. Means you had co-inventors. Who were they?
Just other, usually lab technicians and stuff. The way these patent things work is that everybody who participates gets credit, although the rights to the patents are always assigned to the corporation. So these were Polaroid patents, but very often Land would have collaborators. And that's just the nature of technology and research.
You said that Land dropped out of Harvard when he was a freshman, and yet you referred to him as doctor. Did he get his PhD?
No, he never even got a bachelor's. He did go back to Harvard, but never graduated. But he received dozens and dozens of honorary doctorates, and people started to refer to him as Dr. Land, and it was something that he cherished, to be honest. It was a very interesting aspect, and in fact, there was a moment in the litigation where Kodak sort of dissed Dr. Land a little bit over that issue. Again, you'll read all about it, but he never earned even a bachelor's degree. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you go back 30 or 40 years, these were two giants of the corporate world. What's the status of these two corporations?
They both went bankrupt, and they both still exist. Well, the Polaroid of Land's day does not exist, but there is a new Polaroid. Polaroid went completely bankrupt. Whatever remaining assets it had, a so-called bundle of rights, which consisted of some real estate, the logo, the brand, and so on, were bought by venture capitalists and have been licensed out. So there is a new Polaroid. You can buy a brand new Polaroid camera today that makes small pictures, and it's out there again, but it's not the same Polaroid company. Kodak is no longer in the film business, pretty much. They are in document reproduction or some aspect. Unfortunately, they both really missed the boat on emerging technologies.
I went to an engineering school and I got an alumni magazine, and thumbing through it, and all of a sudden I see that one of the graduates from the school developed digital photography. And I'm reading the article, and the person worked for Kodak.
It's absolutely true. The very first work on digital was done at Kodak, but Kodak was so invested in conventional photography, what they call in the trade silver halide technology, which just means conventional technology. Again, as I mentioned before, they were all over it. They made the chemicals, they made the paper, they made the plastics, they sold the cameras, they made the film and sold the film. They were so invested in that technology that they dismissed digital. And even though the work was done in their labs, they didn't pursue it. Interestingly enough, just one other little aside to your point, because you're sort of insinuating that it was digital photography that ended one-step photography, and it really didn't. That was sort of the second nail in the coffin, really. The first nail in the coffin, and this was actually litigated in the damages part of this case, was 1 hour photo processing. Because all of a sudden, you couldn't get your picture in a minute, but you could get your picture in an hour, and the picture you got in an hour would be much higher quality because it was taken with your fancy SLR camera with all those great lenses and everything else.
A lot of artists still work with Polaroid and large scale. Polaroid, so who makes that now?
There are a couple of companies that do that. There's a company in Holland that emerged from the old Polaroid plant. Some Austrian fellow went and bought the old plant, and they make it's called the Impossible Project, and they make film for it again. It's interesting, and Land always loved, and this is something that Jobs also inherited from him, loved the intersection between art and technology. This is where he lived. This is what he aspired to. Ansel Adams was one of his closest collaborators and advisors. And it's interesting how, at the end of the day, it's the artistic community, the creative that's been the driving force to bring some form of the Polaroid instant photograph back. And there's a documentary, in fact, which I just watched flying out to LA the other day, out there, called Time Zero. It's available on Netflix or any of those kinds of things. It's a documentary that was done in the last 2 or 3 years about exactly that subject, about the demise of Polaroid, and then the screaming of the artistic community to preserve that art form.
Wasn't it a seminal thing, in essence, that there were several judges, and finally a judge was appointed who really got the technology, having no background in technology before, and that was very, very important.
Well, you're right. I mean, this case was a bit of a hot potato. It was a big case with a lot of at stake, and the first 3 judges to whom it was assigned all punted on it for one reason or another and got out from under. And it ended up in the hands of a woman by the name of Raya Zobel, who had just been appointed to the bench by Senator Kennedy and Ted Kennedy. She was from Massachusetts. And she took it, but she was unafraid, and she embraced it, and she tried it. And just 2 points about that. I mean, one is that, you know, our patent system, as technical as these cases are, is based upon having lay people be the fact finders. So it's not like when you have a patent case which involves science and complicated things, that you take it to some special science panel. No, it's supposed to be decided by regular people who may not have any background in science, and it's the art of the patent litigator to simplify these cases and present them in a way that anybody can understand. And the second little caveat, or not caveat, but anecdote related to that, is back in February when the book came out, the very first event that I did was at MIT, in Cambridge, Mass, home of Polaroid, so on and so forth. So it was really an appropriate place to do this. While I'm standing up here, I was a little more nervous then than I am now, because it was my first one, and there were some people there I knew and so on. And almost right before I started, I noticed this woman walk into the audience, trailed by 3 or 4 young people in business attire. And I was thinking about the presentation and so on and so forth, really wasn't paying attention. But then when I looked again right before I started and saw who it was, I almost fainted, because it was Judge Raya Zobel. That same woman who had presided at the Polaroid case came to the event at MIT. She's 82 years old. She still sits on the federal bench in Boston. She hasn't even elected senior status, which judges do to reduce their workload. No, she's still a full-time judge in the federal court in Boston. She came to the event. Luckily, at the end, we had a lovely conversation, and we spoke for a great length after that. And she loves the book, and she was very grateful to me in a very interesting way. You know, as immersed as she was in this case, as much as she knew about it and knew about the merits, you know, and the factual issues in the litigation, she always wondered why. She knew the whats, but she didn't know the whys. You know, why were we there? Why couldn't I convince these 2 companies to settle? You know, why did they risk so much? Why did Kodak act the way they did? Why did Polaroid act the way it did? My book provided that background, that backstory to her, something she had wondered about for 30 years. And she found it absolutely fascinating, because at the time of the case, she had no idea about what had gone on between the individuals and the companies. So it was a lot of fun.
As a newly minted attorney, fresh out of law school, you found yourself in the middle as a key player in this epic legal battle. What was that personal experience like for you to be, you know, in a situation that would be so unusual for someone just out of law school? And a second part to the question, why did you leave the legal profession shortly after?
Well, you know the answer to that, Robert. You know, the first part, I can't remember, and it's such a blur. The reality was I was scared to death. And I just worked hard. I immersed myself in it. And it was tremendously interesting. You know, I found myself in a great circumstance by complete accident. And I just did it, you know, without thinking much about it. I really had no perspective at the time. Nowadays, I wonder, like you did, how the hell did I do that, and how did I survive? And as you know, I never intended to be a lawyer, and I took this job just to make some money out of law school. And I bolted as soon as I could to do a career in the entertainment business. And but writing this book because of the impressions made during that period, was, you know, number one on my bucket list. And when I retired from the music business about 10 years ago, I picked this up and started the research and writing. Yes, sir.
What were the total litigation costs on both sides of the fence for this?
You know what? I don't have an exact number, but at the time, I remember hearing something in the vicinity of $60 million, and that was paid to the two firms. Kenyon & Kenyon represented Kodak. Polaroid share, because I used to joke with my boss about this. I think Fish and Neve billed between $25 and $30 million to Polaroid. And again, this is 1976 dollars and stuff, so it's a lot more, it would be a lot more today. And I always used to joke with them. I said, we have such a slam dunk case. I can't believe you didn't take this on a contingency. You know? Of course, those old white shoe law firms would never do that. So there we go.
I want to thank you so much. This has been an amazing event. Ron will be signing books. There are refreshments over there, and please take a look at the cameras. Thank you for coming.
I do want to thank everybody who came tonight. I really appreciate your coming. Some of you have traveled long distances, but there's one person in particular I want to thank for coming because you know, one of the great things about writing this book and having it out now and having it get a little bit of attention is that I've been able to meet people who are associated one way with the story. And one day I was sitting in my office and the phone rings and some gentleman says, "Is this Ronald ФИрштейн?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, my name is Dick Siegel and I'm Edwin Land's nephew." And I couldn't believe that. And long story short, in the months, and this is only a couple of months ago, Dorsey and I have gotten to know Dick Siegel and his wife Samelia, and I want to thank them for coming up all the way for this event. But this is, Dick is actually the son of Edwin Land's sister, and he's here tonight. So thank you for coming.